autumn of 1932 had painted the Ukrainian steppes in shades of gold that mocked the hunger already gnawing at the bellies of the peasants. Petro Kovalenko stood at the edge of his family's plot, watching the commissars count every last kernel of wheat that his calloused hands had coaxed from the black earth. The grain that should have fed his wife Oksana, his 3 children, and his aging mother through the winter was being loaded into carts destined for Moscow's quotas. "Comrade Kovalenko," barked Commissar Sidorov, a pale man whose belly still curved prosperously beneath his leather coat. "The state requires 4,200 kilograms from your collective plot. You are short by 63 kilograms. Petro's weathered face remained impassive, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. "Comrade Commissar, we have given everything. The children, they haven't eaten meat in 3 weeks. Sidorov's gray eyes were as cold as the approaching winter. "The state's needs supersede individual comfort, Kovalenko. Find the grain, or we will find it for you." Behind the commissar, 3 men in identical dark coats methodically emptied the wooden storage bins that Petro's grandfather had built with his own hands. The bins that had never been empty, not even during the worst harvests of the old times. The scraping of their shovels against bare wood echoed like fingernails on a coffin. 8-year-old Mykola peered around the corner of their clay-walled cottage, his once round cheeks now hollow shadows beneath prominent cheekbones. His sister Katya, only 6, clung to his worn shirt with fingers thin as twigs. Their baby brother Andrei, barely 18 months old, had stopped crying for milk days ago, a silence that terrified Oksana more than his previous wails ever could. "Papa," Mykola whispered when the commissars had loaded their carts and departed, leaving behind only the acrid smell of tobacco and the echo of iron wheels on frozen earth. "When will we eat?" Petro knelt beside his son, placing hands that trembled with more than cold on the boy's sharp shoulders. "Soon, Mykola. Papa will find a way." But even as he spoke the words, Petro knew they tasted of ash and desperation. The party had declared war on the kulaks, the supposedly wealthy peasants who owned their own land. But the definition of kulak had grown, like a cancer consuming first the prosperous, then the merely self-sufficient, and now even the poorest farmers who dared hide a handful of grain for their children. That night, while the November wind howled through the gaps in their thatched roof, the Kovalenko family huddled around their dying fire. Oksana had boiled the last potato peels with some dried nettle leaves, creating a thin broth that was more hope than sustenance. The children sipped it slowly, making each bitter spoonful last. "Mama," Katya's voice was barely audible above the wind. "My tummy hurts." Oksana pulled her daughter closer, feeling the sharp edges of ribs through the child's patched dress. "I know, my love. It will pass." Petro's mother, Baba Maria, sat in the corner, her once mighty frame now a collection of angles beneath layers of worn shawls. She had lived through famines before, the terrible hunger of 1921, the lean years of the early 20s, but nothing like this systematic starvation. Her rheumy eyes fixed on Petro with an intensity that made him look away. "They mean to kill us all," she wheezed, her voice like autumn leaves rustling. "This is not famine. This is murder by hunger." "Mama, the children," Oksana began, but the old woman raised a trembling hand. "The children should know. They should understand what is being done to us and why. We are not dying because God has forsaken us. We are dying because Stalin wishes to break the Ukrainian spirit, to make us beg for Russian bread." Petro stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the dirt floor. "I'm going to look for grain. There must be something the brigades missed." "Where?" Oksana's voice cracked like ice. "They've searched every house 3 times. They've torn apart the wells, dug up the gardens, examined every floorboard. The old hiding place, near the oak grove where my father used to." "Petro," Oksana's tone stopped him cold. Mikhailo tried that yesterday. They caught him with half a cup of rye. They shot him in front of his wife and children. The silence that followed was broken only by baby Andrew's labored breathing. The child had developed a rattling cough that spoke of lungs weakened by hunger, of a small body consuming itself to stay alive. Petro sank back into his chair, head in his hands. Mikhailo had been his childhood friend, a gentle man whose only crime was trying to keep his family from starving. Now his body lay in the unmarked pit behind the collective farm offices, another statistic in Stalin's war against the Ukrainian peasantry. The next morning brought a new horror, the sound of approaching footsteps, too regular to be those of exhausted peasants, too purposeful to bring anything but misery. Petro peered through the frost-covered window and saw his neighbor Ivan Kravets leading 2 NKVD officers toward their cottage. Ivan had once borrowed Petro's ox for plowing. They had shared vodka at harvest festivals, celebrated each other's children's births. But hunger did terrible things to men's souls, and the state rewarded informants with extra rations, sometimes as much as 200 grams of bread for information, leading to the discovery of hidden grain. Open in the name of the state. The command was followed by heavy fists against their wooden door. Oksana gathered the children behind her like a hen protecting her chicks, while Baba Maria struggled to her feet, dignity armor against despair. Petro opened the door to find himself facing Lieutenant Volkov, a man whose reputation for cruelty had spread across 3 districts. Citizen Kovalenko. Volkov's voice was silk wrapped around the blade. We have received information that you possess hidden grain stores. Ivan Kravets stood behind the officers, unable to meet Petro's eyes. His face was gaunt, but not as hollow as those who had refused to collaborate. The moral mathematics of survival had reduced human relationships to simple equations. Your grain or mine, your children or mine. Search if you must, Petro said, stepping aside. We have nothing to hide. The NKVD officers swept through their small home like a plague of locusts. They overturned the wooden chest that held Oksana's dowry linens, scattered the children's few toys, and prodded the walls with bayonets searching for secret compartments. Volkov picked up baby Andrei, who was too weak to protest, examining the child's skeletal frame with clinical detachment. Interesting, he murmured. A child this malnourished, yet I'm told you were seen carrying heavy sacks 3 nights ago. Petro's blood turned to ice water. 3 nights ago, he had indeed carried sacks, but they contained only dead leaves and bark he'd collected to mix with their dwindling flour supply. The desperate measures of a man trying to fill his family's stomachs with anything that might provide bulk, if not nutrition. Those were leaves, Comrade Lieutenant. For soup. Volkov's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Leaves? How creative! And where might one find such nutritious leaves in November? Before Petro could answer, one of the officers called from outside. Lieutenant, we found something. Behind their cottage, where Petro's father had once kept a small vegetable garden, the officers had discovered what appeared to be recently disturbed earth. With methodical efficiency, they began to dig, their shovels biting into soil that had been turned just days before. Oksana's face went white as fresh snow. She knew what they would find, not grain, but something far worse. 3 nights ago, in desperation, they had buried their neighbor's dog, Tuzik, who had died of starvation. They had planned to dig him up when the patrol schedules permitted, to make a soup that might keep them alive another week. The shovel struck something soft, and Volkov's expression shifted from suspicion to disgust as they unearthed the small corpse. The dog's ribs were visible through patchy fur, evidence of his own struggle against the famine. So, Volkov said, wiping his hands on a handkerchief with elaborate care, the Kovalenko family has moved beyond leaves to carrion. How very resourceful. Ivan Kravets backed away, finally understanding that his information had led to the discovery of something that would bring no reward, only shared shame. But it was too late. Association with the accused was often as damning as the crime itself. "This animal died of natural causes," Petro said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We were going to bury it properly when the ground softened." Natural causes. Volkov's smile was a wound across his face. In the Soviet Union, Comrade Kovalenko, nothing dies of natural causes. Everything serves the state, even in death. You will explain to me why you chose to hide this resource instead of reporting it to the collective authorities. The question hung in the frozen air like an executioner's blade. To admit they had planned to eat the dog was to confess to theft of state property, for even dead animals belonged to the collective. To maintain the lie about proper burial was to risk punishment for wasting resources that could have fed other comrades. Petro looked at his children, at his wife, at his mother who had survived the famines of the past, only to face this systematic extermination. He made his choice. "We were hungry, Comrade Lieutenant." The trial, if it could be called that, took place in the collective farm's grain storage building, a bitter irony, since the structure now stood empty save for a few scattered husks and the lingering smell of wheat that would never fill another Ukrainian belly. The local party secretary, Dmitry Borisenko, served as judge, jury, and executioner of souls. Borisenko was himself Ukrainian, born in a village not 20 kilometers away, but the revolution had transformed him into something harder than the steppes in winter. He had learned that survival required the complete abandonment of the old loyalties, to family, to neighbors, to the land itself. Only loyalty to the party could guarantee another day's rations. Petro Semyonovich Kovalenko, Borisenko's voice echoed in the empty chamber. "You stand accused of theft of state property, specifically the concealment of organic matter that could have been utilized for the benefit of the collective." Petro stood straighter despite the weakness in his legs. Around him, other villagers who had been summoned to witness sat on rough wooden benches, their faces carefully blank. To show sympathy was to invite suspicion upon oneself. "I do not deny the accusation, Comrade Secretary. And your accomplices? Surely your wife knew of this theft. Your mother, your children, did they participate in this crime against the people?" Here was the trap, the moment when Stalin's system demanded that even love itself be sacrificed on the altar of ideological purity. Petro could save himself by condemning his family, or he could damn them all together. They knew nothing. I acted alone. Borisenko made a note in his ledger with exaggerated care. "Interesting. You expect us to believe that you could conceal a dead animal from your own family in a two-room cottage. My family is innocent." "Your family," Borisenko said, standing and walking slowly around Petro like a predator circling wounded prey, "lives in a collective farm. They eat collective bread, sleep under collective protection, breathe collective air. There is no individual innocence in a collective system. Comrade Kovalenko, your crime pollutes them all." The sentence was as brutal as it was bureaucratic. The Kovalenko family would be classified as unreliable elements and relocated to a labor settlement in the Urals. Their remaining possessions would be redistributed among loyal collective members. They had 3 days to prepare for transport, but 3 days might as well have been 3 years. As Petro walked home through the village that had been his entire world, he saw the signs of systematic destruction everywhere. The church where he had married Oksana had been converted into a grain storage facility, its icons painted over with portraits of Stalin and Lenin. The school where his children should have been learning to read served as a deportation center, its courtyard filled with the bundled possessions of families awaiting exile. Mrs. Petrenko, who had been his mother's closest friend, crossed herself quickly when she saw him approaching. It was a dangerous gesture. Religion was another crime against the state, but she couldn't help herself. Too many neighbors had simply vanished in the night, leaving behind only empty houses and whispered prayers. "Petro," she whispered as he passed her yard. "Take this." She pressed something into his hand, a small piece of dried meat, probably saved from her own meager rations. It was an act of kindness that could cost her everything. "I cannot," he began. "For the children," she insisted, then hurried back into her house before anyone could witness their exchange. Petro looked at the meat in his palm. It was perhaps 30 grams, enough for one thin soup. It represented hope, sacrifice, and the enduring humanity that Stalin's system could not quite extinguish. It also represented a choice: eat it themselves and extend their suffering by perhaps a day, or trade it to Ivan Kravitz for information about the transport schedules. He closed his fist around Mrs. Petrenko's gift and made his decision. That evening, Petro called his family together around their cold fireplace. The last of their furniture had been burned for warmth days ago, leaving only bare walls and the memory of better times. "We leave tomorrow night," he announced without preamble. "Before the transport comes." Oksana looked up from baby Andriy, who lay listless in her arms. "Where can we go?" "The borders are sealed. The cities check papers. Anyone caught traveling without permits." "South," Petro said. "To your cousin in the Kuban. If we can reach her village, perhaps." "That's over 400 kilometers," Baba Maria interrupted, her voice a rasp of disbelief. "In winter, with children. We would never survive the journey." "We will not survive the deportation either, Mama. The camps in the Urals. They say fewer than half return." The truth of this hung in the air, like smoke from their dying fire. They had all heard the stories, whispered in corners and passed along with the currency of fear. Families torn apart, children separated from parents. Men worked to death in lumber camps, while their wives and daughters faced worse fates in textile factories. Mykola, though only 8, understood more than his parents realized. "Papa, will they hurt us if they catch us?" Petro knelt before his son, taking the boy's thin face in his hands. "They will not catch us, son. We know these lands better than any commissar from Moscow. We know where the streams run fresh, where the forests provide shelter. We are Ukrainian. This earth is in our blood." But even as he spoke these brave words, Petro felt the terrible weight of their impossibility. They had no food for the journey, no warm clothes for the children, no guarantee that Oksana's cousin was even still alive. They were choosing between certain death and almost certain death, guided only by the slim hope that movement was better than surrender. The moon was a silver coin lost in clouds when the Kovalenko family slipped from their cottage for the last time. Oksana carried baby Andriy wrapped in every blanket they possessed, while Petro shouldered a sack containing their few remaining possessions: a pot, a knife, a packet of salt, and Mrs. Petrenko's precious piece of meat. Baba Maria moved slowly, each step a negotiation between will and flesh. At 73, she had already outlived most of her generation, but the months of gradual starvation had reduced her to a collection of fragile bones held together by determination and grief. They avoided the main roads, following paths that Petro had known since childhood. Deer trails through the oak, forests' shepherd's tracks across the winter-brown meadows, smugglers' routes that his father had shown him in whispered conversations years before the revolution had made such knowledge treasonous. By dawn, they had covered perhaps 8 kilometers, stopping frequently to rest and to let Baba Maria catch her labored breath. They sheltered in an abandoned shepherd's hut, its walls thick with the smell of sheep and old straw. "Listen," Petro whispered. In the distance, they could hear the sound of search parties, men calling, dogs barking, the mechanical rhythm of vehicles on the frozen roads. The state had discovered their absence with the dawn, and now the machinery of pursuit was grinding into motion. "They'll search south first," Oksana said, adjusting Andriy's blankets with shaking hands. "Everyone tries to reach the warmer regions. Then we go east, into the forest country. Find somewhere to wait until the searches move on. Mykola tugged at his father's coat. Papa, what about our house? Who will take care of it? Petro closed his eyes against the image of their cottage, the place where he had been born, where his children had taken their first steps, where 3 generations of his family had lived and loved and hoped. By now, other families would be moving into it, trying to make homes in the spaces where ghosts of the displaced still lingered. The house will find new people to care for it, he said finally. Houses are patient. They wait. For 6 days, they moved deeper into the ancient forests that carpeted the region between the Dnieper and the Don. These were old woods, planted not by human hands, but by centuries of wind and wildlife, thick with oak and birch and pine that had sheltered partisans and refugees throughout Russia's bloody history. Petro knew these forests from hunting expeditions with his father, from the mushroom-gathering expeditions of his youth, when such foraging had been a pleasure rather than a desperate necessity. Now he searched for anything edible, bark that could be ground into flour, roots that might provide a few calories, frozen berries that the birds had missed. On the 3rd day, they found a deer that had died recently, killed by wolves but not yet fully consumed. The sight of fresh meat made their stomachs clench with desperate hunger, but Petro examined the carcass carefully. The wolves had eaten the organs and much of the hindquarters, leaving behind pieces that might be salvageable if prepared carefully. Is it safe? Oksana asked, watching him cut away portions that seemed relatively untouched. Safer than starving, he replied, though he knew that even this windfall might only delay their fate by a few days. They built a small fire in a depression, hidden by overhanging branches, using dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. The meat roasted slowly, filling their nostrils with a smell that was simultaneously salvation and torment. When it was ready, Petro divided it carefully, giving the largest portions to the children and saving the smallest for himself. Mykola devoured his share with the focused intensity of a wolf cub, while Katya nibbled hers slowly, as if trying to make each bite last forever. Baby Andrei was too weak to chew solid food, so Oksana chewed pieces for him, passing the pre-digested meat from her mouth to his, like a mother bird feeding her young. Better, Baba Maria said, after swallowing her portion. But not enough. And this will not last. She was right, of course. The meat might sustain them for 2 or 3 days, but winter was tightening its grip on the land. Snow had begun to fall in earnest, covering their tracks but also making travel exponentially more difficult. Soon, the forest paths would become impassable, the streams would freeze solid, and their chances of survival would approach 0. On the 7th day, weak and stumbling, they encountered another family fleeing through the woods, the Shevchenkos from a village 30 kilometers north. Yuri Shevchenko was a blacksmith, a trade that had kept his family slightly better fed than most farmers. But the state's hunger for metal had been almost as voracious as its appetite for grain. Kovalenko? Yuri's voice held disbelief. What are you doing here? The same as you, I think, Petro replied, running from paradise. The Shevchenkos had 2 daughters, twins aged 12, and Yuri's elderly father. They had been traveling for 10 days, moving mostly at night, surviving on a diet of tree bark and occasional small game. The twins, Vera and Oksana, were named for saints that looked like wraiths, their hair falling out in patches from malnutrition. There's a village, Yuri said, pointing southeast through the trees. Borshov, small place, maybe 50 families. They say the brigades haven't reached it yet. Hope flared in Petro's chest, painful as a fresh wound. A village that had escaped the quota system might have food, might offer shelter, might provide the miracle they needed to keep their children alive. But Baba Maria shook her head slowly. If we know about it, boy, so do they. Borshov is bait in a trap. What choice do we have? Oksana asked, her voice hollow with exhaustion. Andrei, cannot survive another week in the forest. They looked at the baby, whose breathing had become increasingly shallow. His eyes, once bright with infant curiosity, now stared at nothing but the flat acceptance of approaching death. The choice was between almost certain doom in the village and certain death in the wilderness. We try for Borshev, Petro decided, but carefully. We watch first, learn the situation before we commit ourselves. Borshev nestled in a valley between low hills, its houses arranged around a central square, dominated by a church whose onion dome had been painted red instead of traditional gold, a signal of political compliance that might have saved it from destruction. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and they could see people moving in the streets with something approaching normal energy. The two families spent a full day observing the village from the forest edge, watching for signs of NKVD presence or unusual military activity. What they saw seemed almost miraculous. Children playing in the snow, women carrying buckets that appeared to contain actual food, men working on repairs to buildings rather than standing in endless queues for non-existent rations. "It's real," Yuri whispered. "Somehow they've escaped." But Baba Maria's ancient eyes had seen deeper. "Look at the church, grandson. Look carefully." Petro followed her gaze and felt his heart sink. The red dome was not just painted. It was newly painted, the color bright and fresh despite the winter weather. And arranged around the church were the dark shapes of vehicles covered with canvas tarps. "A Potemkin village," the old woman said. "They know people are fleeing through these forests. They've created this theater to draw in the desperate." As if summoned by her words, they saw movement in the forest on the village's far side, other figures approaching through the trees, other families drawn by the same desperate hope that had guided the Kovalenkos and Shevchenkos to this place. "We have to warn them," Oksana said. "We cannot," Petro replied, though the words tasted like poison. "To reveal ourselves is to die. To save strangers is to kill our own children." They watched in helpless horror as three families, perhaps 15 people in total, emerged from the forest and approached the village. They were greeted warmly by villagers who offered bread and hot soup, who led them toward buildings that promised warmth and safety. The trap closed with mechanical precision, and KVD officers emerged from concealment, surrounding the refugees with practiced efficiency. There was no dramatic confrontation, no desperate flight, just the quiet, bureaucratic capture of people whose only crime was the biological necessity of eating. As night fell over Borshev, the Kovalenko and Shevchenko families faced their most terrible decision yet. The faked village had revealed the full extent of the state's reach. There was no escape south, no sanctuary in the forests, no hope of reaching safety through conventional flight. "We could surrender," Yuri suggested without conviction. "Present ourselves voluntarily." Sometimes they show mercy to those who confess their errors. "They showed mercy to the Bratskys," Baba Maria replied. "Shot Pavel in front of his pregnant wife, then sent her to the camps. She gave birth to a dead child in a cattle car. The state's mercy is a bullet instead of starvation." Baby Andrey's breathing had become so shallow that Oksana had to place her ear against his chest to confirm he still lived. The child was dying by degrees, his small body consuming itself in a process that would soon become irreversible. "There is another way," Petro said quietly. The others looked at him, reading the terrible knowledge in his eyes. "No," Oksana breathed. "We cannot. We will not. The children, Oksana, look at them. Really look." She looked and saw what he saw. Mikola's skin stretched tight over prominent bones, Katya's hair falling out in clumps, Andrey's eyes already focusing on something beyond the physical world. They were losing the children by pieces, watching them fade like photographs left too long in sunlight. "There are berries," Petro continued in the same quiet voice. "Pokeweed berries. In the ravine where we camped 2 nights ago. They grow purple and fat, even in winter." Everyone understood. Pokeweed berries were poisonous, but they looked wholesome, almost inviting. Children sometimes ate them by mistake, dying within hours but peacefully, as if falling into a deep sleep. It would be quick, Petro thought. Quicker than starvation, kinder than the camps. No, Oksana repeated, but her voice had lost its conviction. Yuri Shevchenko spoke for the first time in hours. My father, he has spoken of this. In the old country, when the harvests failed completely, sometimes the elders would walk into the winter to save food for the children. But the children are dying anyway. Vera, one of the twins, said with the brutal honesty of adolescence. We're all dying. At least this way, we choose how. They did not make the choice that night, nor the next day, nor the day following. Instead, they moved deeper into the forest, driven by an animal instinct to keep moving, to postpone the final decision for as long as possible. But their pace slowed with each passing hour, and their conversations became shorter, interrupted by longer silences. On the 9th day of their flight, they found an abandoned hunter's cabin. Its roof partially collapsed, but its walls still solid enough to provide shelter from the wind. Inside, they discovered treasures that seemed impossible. A rusted axe, some fishing line, and most miraculously, a cache of dried mushrooms that had been forgotten in a clay jar. The mushrooms were probably 2 years old, tough as leather and tasting of dust, but they represented life. Oksana soaked them in melted snow until they softened enough to chew, then divided them with mathematical precision among the family members. How long will this last? Mykola asked, examining his portion with the serious attention of a child who had learned to calculate survival in terms of individual mouthfuls. 3 days, maybe 4 if we're careful, his father replied. And then? Petro had no answer to give his son. The winter was deepening, their strength was failing, and the forest had already given up its last secrets. Soon, even pokeweed berries would be buried beneath snow too deep to penetrate. That night, as his family slept fitfully around the cabin's small fireplace, Petro sat awake, contemplating the final mathematics of love. How many days of suffering were justified by the slim possibility of survival? At what point did continuing to struggle become cruelty rather than hope? Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of search parties, still hunting for families like theirs, still feeding the machinery of systematic starvation. Inside, baby Andrew's breathing grew fainter with each passing hour. Dawn brought the sound that Petro had been dreading, the mechanical growl of vehicles approaching through the forest. The NKVD had found their trail, perhaps through dog teams, perhaps through informants who had seen their passage. It no longer mattered how. What mattered was that their time had run out. Wake up, he whispered urgently, shaking Oksana gently. They've found us. She opened her eyes immediately, the sleep of the starving being shallow and easily broken. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know. How long do we have? Minutes, perhaps. They're moving slowly, searching every structure. Baba Maria struggled to sit up, her movements now painful to watch. So it ends here. Not yet, Mama. There's a ravine behind the cabin. We can lower the children down, hide them in the rocks until what, son? Until we all freeze together instead of being shot separately. The approaching engines grew louder, and through the cabin's broken windows, they could see lights flickering between the trees. Search beams cutting through the morning mist, methodical and inexorable. Oksana looked at baby Andrei, whose eyes had not opened for the past 6 hours. She touched his chest, feeling for the flutter of heartbeat that had grown ever fainter. He's gone, she whispered. The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Their youngest child, the baby who had learned to smile before he learned hunger, had slipped away sometime during the night. His small face was peaceful, almost serene, as if death had been a relief from the pain of existence. My son, Petro breathed, reaching out to touch the tiny forehead that was already growing cold. The sound of vehicle doors slamming echoed through the forest. Voices called in Russian. Orders snapped with military precision. The search party was perhaps 50 meters away. "They will not take the living children," Petro said, his voice carrying a finality that made Oksana's blood freeze. "Not to those camps, not to that suffering." He moved toward the pokeweed berries he had gathered the previous evening, the purple clusters that promised peace through poison. But Mykola, thin as he was, moved faster. "No, Papa." The boy stood between his father and the berries, 8 years old and fierce as a young wolf. "We don't choose for them. They choose for themselves." "Mykola, Katya," the boy called to his sister. "Come here." Katya approached slowly, her eyes wide with understanding beyond her years. The voices outside were getting closer, and soon the decision would be taken from them entirely. "Do you want to go with the men in the dark coats?" Mykola asked his sister with devastating directness. She shook her head immediately. "They smell bad, and they're mean. Then we have to choose. The berries will make us sleep, and we won't hurt anymore. Or we can hide, and maybe they won't find us." It was impossible, Petro thought. A 6-year-old child could not be asked to make such a choice. But the alternative was to make it for her, and that seemed even more impossible. "I want to sleep," Katya said simply. "I'm very tired." Mykola nodded solemnly, then looked at his parents. "We choose sleep." The pokeweed berries were surprisingly sweet, their purple juice staining small fingers as the children ate them with the focused attention they had once given to candy. Oksana and Petro took their own portions, while Baba Maria held baby, Andrey's still form, and whispered prayers in Ukrainian that the state had tried to erase from memory. Outside, the search party had found the cabin. Boots trampled through the underbrush. Voices called orders in Russian that carried the authority of empire. But inside the small space, a different kind of empire was ending. The empire of a family's love, the kingdom of shared hopes and private jokes and whispered lullabies. "Tell us the story about the golden fish," Katya said.